It's one of the biggest decisions the government has to make, affecting millions of us, cutting billions in welfare spending and at the heart of their plans for the economy. But nobody yet knows what they will do. Tonight we get a first glimpse of government thinking on how to cut the £200 billion welfare budget. We'll examine options which could affect almost every home in the country, with politicians, an entrepreneur and a think tank thinker.
We know the government wants to save at least another £10 billion from the Department of Work and Pensions. Tonight, we investigate some of the options they're looking at.
Evening, with the possible exception of Buckingham Palace, the residents of just about every house in the country will be affected by changes to Britain's welfare bill. The Chancellor, George Osborne, said in his budget this year that further cuts of £10 billion or so might be necessary, while a former Downing Street advisor suggested saving another £25 billion from the £200 billion total. Tonight we're going to get a look at what the government is considering, and we'll debate whether such cuts are really necessary, whichever party is in power. We begin with David Grossman, who's been figuring out where your money goes and when the cuts which have already been announced will begin to bite. David.
Let's start, Gavin, with that big fat figure you talked about, £200 billion. That's the amount we spend on welfare every year. Now, roughly half of that goes to pensioners, half of it to people of working age. If we look at the graph behind me, about looking back in time, you can see it's gone up and up till the red line, which is where we are now. Gone up by about 55% in real terms since 1997. A big part of that growth was the introduction of tax credits administered by HMRC. At the moment, the total welfare spend is around 13% of GDP. Or, to put it another way, out of every £8 generated in the UK, more than £1 is spent on welfare. But moving forward in those projections, you can see it levelling off or coming down slightly from 13% of GDP to 11%. Now, the first thing to say about that, of course, is it's a government projection of savings going forward into the future, and we know from past experience they don't always materialise. However, the government says it has introduced some big changes that will have effect. The big one, or one of the big ones that we've heard about, is the benefits cap. Now, that will mean that in the future, someone in a family or a couple will only be able to earn £500 a week in benefits. For a single person, £350 a week. It's part of what the government calls the universal credit. It's designed to cut the complexity and always, they say, always make work pay more than being on welfare. Another big change, getting rid of child benefit for those on higher incomes. Earn more than £60,000 a year in the future and you won't get any child benefit, and it will start being phased out after £50,000 a year. Another big change, replacement of the disability living allowance with the personal independence payment. The government says that should cut around 500,000 people from the claimant count. But talk to ministers and they will tell you passionately, as well as saving money, the guiding philosophy behind these reforms is helping people stop being on benefits. Getting into work is always better for people, they say. At the moment, more than 1 in 4 working-age adults in the UK do not work, and around 2.6 million people have spent at least half of the last 10 years on some form of out-of-work benefits. So the cost is both human and it's financial. And the government says it has to save even more money than already has been outlined. In his budget speech this year, the Chancellor said that by 2016 we're going to have to cut another £10 billion, or something around £10 billion, from the welfare budget. So how might he be thinking of doing it? Well, one option, of course, is winter fuel payments. At the moment, £2.1 billion a year goes to pensioners to help them with their winter fuel, but it's not means tested at the moment. That means it goes to millionaires as well as those in need. But any meaningful change to get that kind of money they're looking for is going to have to take into account things like tax credits, £28.5 billion, and housing benefit, £23.7 billion. But all of that, of course, is politically extremely difficult. It's not for nothing that in American politics, that welfare reform is known as a third-rail issue. Touch it, Gavin, and you die.
David, thanks very much. Well, those are the numbers, but what are the options, and how politically toxic is it for the government, any government, to consider cutting money from some of the poorest among us? Our political editor, Allegra Stratton, has been doing some blue sky thinking.
Asking about someone's welfare was once just looking through a window into someone's life, their health, their happiness, their good or bad fortune. It came to mean how the state looked after us when we fell on hard times. The doors, the roof, the windows. Now the word and its many meanings are less clear, and it enjoys less unthinking support. But it sprawls. Left unchecked by 2016, welfare will become a third of all government spending per year. And so they feel they must cut more.
So I am today publishing analysis that shows that if, in the next spending review, we maintain the same rate of reductions in departmental spending as we've done in this review, we would need to make savings in welfare of £10 billion by 2016.
Welfare is in the dock because the public say they want welfare to be in the dock. The Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg once contemplated blocking some of his Tory partners' ideas on welfare. He didn't when he saw the weight of the opinion polling in its favour. Ian Duncan-Smith appears to have been pretty unimpressed when the Chancellor announced, we think without consultation with him, that there would be a further £10 billion worth of cuts to the welfare budget. That's in addition to the £18 billion. And there's many who think you can't go much deeper in without going very painfully into people's lives. And there's also an assessment that the public mood is quite finely balanced, that you at the moment have support for the welfare reforms, but that could tip very quickly into animosity if you blunder into people's lives. But those changes that they could and might make will be about values. There's a feeling in government that there are lifestyles people can't afford. That goes for them in the city as well as for families. Explain to me, just tell me a bit about your situation. You've got a daughter or a son?
Daughter, yeah, she's going to be 3 next month. We live together, just me and her. I got that accommodation not through the council, but I found it myself and then applied for housing benefits separately.
You're on housing benefit, you get help from the state for your housing. Don't you think that you should have possibly lived at home until the point at which you could support your own house?
Well, I find that living at home with my mum just wouldn't be an option really, space-wise. There's not enough space for...
How big's her flat or house?
She does have a 2-bedroom flat.
It doesn't sound to me like your house and your mother's house, your mother's flat, is a bad place. So it's a choice you're making, and it's a choice that comes with a price tag attached.
Yes, it's a choice, but at the same time, you know, I don't think living in my mum's house would have been... It wouldn't have been constructive.
I mean, we both know people that are living with their parents, they don't have a job, and they have fights, that's what happens, but they don't have a financial choice.
I think that's the difference, because I'm asking for help towards, I'm not asking for a free handout.
The lesson for officials across Whitehall looking at the last £18 billion worth of cuts to the welfare budget is that you can do a lot with flow, but not so much with stock. What do those two pieces of jargon mean? Well, flow is a flow on and off unemployment benefit. Stock are those for whom it is more difficult to get work. The government is thinking of saying to young people, if you don't have work, don't leave home. We're being cruel to be kind. If you left home, you'd have to go into the housing benefits system, and it would mean you'd have entered the benefits system, and you were much more likely to spend, in their words, a lifetime on benefits. Equally, what's the messaging around young women and getting pregnant? If you think you can get pregnant and the state will help you out, then you're less worried about the consequences of doing so. These are the kind of things, radical and not so radical, that they are looking at. Tory MPs point across to the US, where in 1996, Bill Clinton allowed American states to impose so-called family caps on children born to families on welfare. More recently, though an age ago in the life cycle of the coalition, a cabinet minister reiterated this could be the direction of travel.
Well, the number of children that you have is a choice. And what we're saying is that if people are living on benefits, then they make choices, but they also have to have responsibility for those choices. And it's not going to be the role of the state to finance those choices.
Changes to benefits that affect families and children are probably a distraction. The next really big savings will come from somewhere completely different.
Well, I think when it comes to benefits for people out of work and for families with children, we do want to reform the system, but it shouldn't be driven by fiscal cost. I mean, there's good reasons for reforming things like the housing benefit, and that we want the system to work better for people, but it's not going to rescue the public finances. If you want to rescue the public finances, you have to look at pensions and you have to look at the middle class benefits.
And so a debate started by the Tory leadership that they need 10 billion extra worth of welfare cuts could actually end up rebounding on them. At the last election, the Prime Minister said that he ruled out any movement on winter fuel payments being ended. Incidentally, that's just a tiny part of the pot. Well, now there's a suggestion there could be movement on that in the next Tory manifesto. But other people, including in his own party, think the movement has to be much sooner than that. And to those who say that that will require an embarrassing about-turn by the Prime Minister, well, even Tories say, look at Nick Clegg. He did an embarrassing U-turn on tuition fees. Now it's time, Prime Minister, for you to do yours.
I think you could reach 10 billion if you really focused on the middle class welfare, but let's not underestimate how hard it will be to get there. So what I'd say is, first of all, let's start with the winter fuel allowance, let's start with the free bus passes and the TV licences, and get rid of those benefits we know are really poor value for money, and then we can think about making further savings down the track.
So the coalition leadership wants to go for more cuts to the welfare bill. As they look for options for where to go next, they're already realising the first cut was the deepest.
Allegra Stratton there. Ken Livingstone is one of those who has over the years opposed welfare cuts. Harriet Baldwin is a Tory MP who believes some radical thinking might be necessary. Graham Cook has been studying the options for the think tank IPPR, and he worked as a special advisor to Labour's Secretary of State James Purnell at the Department of Work and Pensions. And Kavita Oberoi is a businesswoman who worries that welfare helps some people become more work-shy rather than more prosperous. Just the big picture first, the case for another 10 million, or perhaps another 25 million, 10 billion or 25 billion, as some have suggested. What is the case to make those kind of savings?
I think the most important thing that we've got to focus on is improving the incentives to go into work. And as you saw from the package that David presented earlier, with 1 in 4 adults in workless households and a doubling of the number of workless households under the previous government, I think it is incredibly important that we reform the benefit system, bring in universal credit and really create incentives for people to take
save money,
jobs.
It's to save money, isn't it?
Well, the best way to save the welfare bill is to help people into work, isn't it? I mean, welfare should be there, it should be a safety net, it should be a strong safety net, but it shouldn't be a sticky safety net that prevents you actually from moving back into work.
Could you save 25 billion more?
I think the 25 billion figure that Steve Hilton apparently left on the desk in Downing Street is going to be a myth. I really don't see that happening.
But 10 billion is doable, perhaps?
I think that there are things that you could look at, and the package raised some of them. For example, although I agree that in our manifesto we said that we shouldn't do anything with winter fuel allowances, I think to give it to millionaires doesn't make sense, and I think we should perhaps reduce the level at which you get the winter fuel allowance to something like a £60,000 income.
We'll come on to some of that in a moment, but is your position no cuts to welfare bill?
I mean, I can immediately think of some cuts to the welfare bill. You had 23 billion up there on the wall behind you, housing benefit. Well, you could cut 10 billion off that by introducing caps on rents. The government's gone about it by attacking the tenants, and I don't know what it's like in other parts of the country, but here in London, to rent a 2-bedroom flat takes 60% of the average take-home pay. Rents have got out of control.
Right. But you accept the principle that the welfare bill itself is out of control for one reason or another. You accept that principle.
The whole welfare strategy has gone wrong. Right. I became an MP in '87. I was stunned to have unemployed people coming to my surgery saying, I've lost my job. I went to the DHSS to say I'm looking for work, and they said, why don't you go on disability benefit or sickness? They were trying to massage down the unemployment figures, and they created a dependency culture.
Now, you looked at this, Graham, and you tried to figure out what was politically possible. I mean, Labour in power would have to look for significant welfare cuts. There's, in that sense, a bit of a political consensus on this.
Yeah, look, the welfare bill is about a quarter of all public spending, so you can't exempt the benefits bill from efforts to reduce the deficit. But I think you've got to start by looking at why the benefits bill is rising, and one of those reasons is that we've not got growth in the economy, we've got unemployment high. That's one of the reasons we've got so many people who are out of work, and you've also got to have a strategy for how you want to move money around in the welfare system.
Could you save 10 billion? Or 25 billion, as Steve Hilton suggested? Could you actually do it?
Well, I think there's an argument for looking at some of the pensioner benefits that go to those on high incomes. You could also look at pension tax relief that also overwhelmingly benefits those on high incomes. Actually, if you restricted pension tax relief to the basic rate and means-tested winter fuel allowance and free TV licences, you'd be at about 10 billion. But I'd argue the more important thing is to look strategically at what do we want to prioritise in our welfare system. Should we shift from benefits to services? Should we do something along the lines that Ken said, which is move from subsidising rents towards building homes? My worry with the government is that they're just lopping bits off the system rather than deciding what their priorities are.
Where do you come in this? I mean, do you take the sort of moral point that we heard a little earlier, that this is good for people because it will get them to work? Is that your point?
I mean, I empathise with people who are on benefits, who really should be on benefits. A few years ago, I went out to Mumbai, and there is no welfare system, and in Mumbai, begging isn't allowed. So what does that do? That changes people's behaviours, and people then start thinking, because they need income, they need to earn money, so they start thinking more entrepreneurially.
But I take it you don't want, you know, Indian conditions of labour here, do you?
No, absolutely not. But what we need to do is drive different behaviours. People should be responsible as well for their own behaviours and drive entrepreneurship. Drive entrepreneurship. I saw there families getting together, it's Valentine's Day, getting out there, selling things around Valentine's Day. We need to drive entrepreneurship, more startups.
Right, but aren't there some people who are frankly untouchable in this, and some of the people that you were talking about, some of the older people, pensioners, you can't touch that. You might be able to do it in theory, but you try touching winter fuel allowance and people will not vote for you.
Well, obviously it's big politically controversial, but look, pensioners account for over 40% of the benefits bill. You can't reduce the benefits bill unless you look at some of the pensioner benefits. And the idea that, you know, capping benefits for a number of children you have, or even the benefits cap only saved about £200 million. I mean, these are sideshows to the big issues. And if you want to save money in the benefit system, you've got to look at what's driving the rises. It's higher rents, it's higher unemployment, it's low wages that have to be subsidised through tax credits.
Right, and you support the idea broadly of a cap on families, don't you?
I think we should have, which I understand unusually is actually a Labour Party policy. We have a policy from the Labour Party on this, which is to have a regional benefit cap. And I think that we should have a regionalised cap in terms of benefits. One of the Clinton reforms that we heard about earlier on the package was that they looked at the different labour markets in the different parts of the country. And I think there's no question we have different labour markets in different parts of our country.
Do you think if somebody chooses to have 6 children or 7 children, there comes a point where the state should no longer support those extra children?
I think that if you have never worked and you continue to increase the size of your family never having worked, I think that we ought to be asking the question, is there a better way that we can help you to find a better way for you to support your family going forward?
By cutting your benefits if you have more than 5 children?
Well, actually, Gordon Brown had an idea of putting perhaps young parents either with their own parents or in a kind of foyer and helping them with training and education. That was another of the Clinton reforms, to make the increase in welfare, when you increase your size of your family, dependent on training and education.
I think it's obscene that someone who might be earning £1 million a year is claiming their winter fuel allowance. But there's 2 ways of tackling that. You can either have a whole load of bureaucrats checking each individual and having some sort of benefit cap, or you can take that money back through a more progressive tax system. And governments, Labour and Tory, have been terrified of actually having a more progressive tax system. That's one way of claiming it back.
But winter fuel allowance, bus passes even? I mean, TV licenses.
But the best way to do that is to do it through a progressive tax system.
Do you claim really because now you're retired? Do you claim such things?
No,
do you take a winter fuel allowance?
I didn't think it was right, 2 years ago, to claim my state pension when I was earning quite comfortably. And I think that was wrong. But I know most rich people most probably do. That is wrong. But the way to claw that back...
Means testing is wrong.
Well, means testing is... when you actually look at how means testing works, what happens is an awful lot of people who should claim end up not claiming. The thing about the bus pass, which we introduced, is we always looked at, do you want to employ several thousand bureaucrats to check each individual whether they should be paying or whether they shouldn't? And it's much better to use the tax system to claw this back. You've got all those bureaucrats in the tax inspectorate. Let them do it.
Use the bureaucrats in the tax inspectorate to claw it back.
Education, just going back to education, I go into a number of schools and communities where there are generations of families that have just not worked. And why is that happening? You know, why is that continuing generation? Is that the thing that's being aspired to, just not to work?
Well, why do you think it's happening?
I think our benefit system does make it an easy choice sometimes, because if you do go out to work and if you're on a minimum pay job, then maybe it's easier not to work because then you're not in benefit that much.
If you go back to a time when I left school in the 60s, 2,000 boys in an ordinary state school in Brixton, every boy got a job, and that job paid them enough to support wife and family. No, I didn't know anyone on benefits through my 20s. We have lost the jobs that working class people used to get. Right. We wiped out manufacturing, all those areas where people could, without going to university, have a good job. They've gone.
I just want to bring in Graham on that, because you have been thinking about it at the Department of Work and Pensions. Is it actually, though, politically possible? Because when you do any of these things, you get into the granny tax trap, you're robbing older people, you're robbing the poor. It's politically almost impossible to do this, isn't it?
Well, I think it is if you don't have an argument about what sort of system you're trying to bring about. If what you're just trying to do is lock bits off the system here and there, then it's very hard to come up with a justification for that, which is why I think you've got to have an argument about where you might shift money. So, for instance, one of the things you could do is look at holding down the growth in child benefit over a period of time and switching some of that money into childcare. Because with restricted resources as a country, we need to think about investing in services that are going to raise our employment rate over the long term.
But as soon as you do that, the people who are hit will protest, and some of them are middle-income people, relatively well off compared to some other people, and they protest very articulately about it being unfair.
No, sure, there are huge political difficulties with it, but, you know, there is a significant budget deficit, welfare's got to play its part, and you've got to make an argument about how the system is going to be better and different with less money around.
Is this about, frankly, reworking the welfare state, and any government's going to have to tackle it?
Well, the universal credit is going to be so crucial. Let me give you an example from my constituency this week. I had all the growers came up from Worcestershire farms to say that they were having to import labour from as far afield as Moldova in order to take the picking jobs that students used to do in the old days. And because of the way that the benefit system is so sticky, it's very sticky as to where you're located as well, because once you have the house, you can't really move somewhere else. These jobs have accommodation for the summer. You can return with thousands of pounds, which is what, you know, students from Moldova are doing. I think we do have to make sure that the universal credit, which will come in starting, I think the pilot is in 6 months' time, will really actually make those incentives for moving into work, and that's the best form of welfare reform you can have.
Will it save enough?
Well, I mean, I think universal credit is a good idea, but I mean, largely it's a tidying up exercise. It's amalgamating lots of benefits. There's an overclaiming going on.
There's the 65 pence withdrawal rate, which is much more attractive.
There are some improved work incentives, but it's been slightly overclaimed that suddenly, by putting all these benefits together and slightly reducing the marginal deduction rates, that suddenly you're going to get millions of people into work. I think,
and therefore you won't save as much as people think you might save.
Well, I think one thing to remember is it's only about 10% of the benefits bill is spent on the main out-of-work benefits like JSA or employment support allowance. So the big ticket items of spending aren't there. Now, that doesn't take away from the fact that we need to get more people into work and we need a higher employment rate.
Do you accept that you've got to reform, in fact, change the welfare state, otherwise it won't exist?
Everyone accepts that. I mean, I started work 50 years ago. I can't conceive not doing something each day. The idea you sit at home and watch daytime TV, and it's the most depressing sort of prospect. But that means we've got to create jobs. We've moved away from being a full employment economy. And we've got, I mean, in London, we've got 1/3 families on waiting lists. Every builder and architect is looking for work. The Lib Dems in government are looking at accessing pension funds to fund a proper public works programme and house building. Put those people back to work, they spend that money, it creates more jobs, it has a knock-on. Let's start thinking about getting people back into jobs rather than just punishing people who haven't got one.
But if the jobs aren't there, and, you know, we're always talking about growth and where the jobs are coming from, then I think, you know, money should be invested into really providing aspiration and inspiration into young and to everybody, because these days the world is a different place. You can start. I started my business in my bedroom on a laptop. It's cost, you know, it doesn't cost what it used to cost years ago, and I think we need to drive that more so. And we are seeing a lot more startups now, and I think that's really important, because if there isn't the jobs, then what are we going to do? We've got to do something different.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you all very much.